Okay, we're carrying on now. Last week we got up to speed with Machiavelli and the developments in the Renaissance. As you will recall me saying that although there was a pagan seam, if you like, through the Reformation, which becomes very pronounced in the case of Machiavelli, the Renaissance and the Reformation are really two designates by historians that sometimes give the impression that there's a major chronological difference between the two. And as we saw last week, we can see elements that are very important and moves made by the reformers, as they'll be called, which were made in the Middle Ages itself. So these processes are happening relatively concurrently. So the designates are really identifying different structural features, so to speak, of these two movements. But people being what they are all intertwined in many ways. Nevertheless, obviously, when we're speaking about the Reformation, we're talking about a major movement within the church. Now, there had been many attempts within the church, again, I may have said this, to try and get rid of the toxicity that had been accruing to it. And that included things like new monastic orders. It included things like, I don't think I mentioned this, what's called the conciliar movement, which was a kind of attempt to provide a more communal-based participation within the church. And in some ways, the Reformation is a continuation of the conciliar movement, but it's taking on board a number of other features which ultimately will disrupt the unity of Christendom that had largely undertaken a more centralized form. So never really completely. There were all these political conflicts going on, and because the papacy, as you remember, was also a territorial player, a terrestrial player, so to speak, in geopolitics, and not just a spiritual power, this all gets very muddy. Nevertheless, by the time we hit the 16th century, with the development of humanism especially, because now, so that's something we usually often associate with the Renaissance, but that was leading people to go back and read things in the original language. So you might recall the humanists, they were finding all these books that had previously lain fallow, and they were being discovered in libraries, and then there were translations taking place, and at the same time, scholars wanted to go back and read the Bible in the original languages. And one of the most famous of those scholars was a character called Erasmus. I mention him because not only was he a consummate humanist, he also attacked monastic life in the church, very big on attacking that. He also attacked scholasticism, that is the Aristotelian influence within the universities, and he's often been said to have been the person that laid the egg that hatched Luther, that was hatched Luther, so to speak. So what that's really saying is there's all sorts of reformist tendencies within Erasmus, but ultimately Erasmus, who was great revivalist of the classics, for example, at one stage he even says, "Oh, Saint Socrates, pray for me." And if you read Erasmus, you'll see that his reading of Paul is very much as if Paul was a kind of philosopher along the lines of Socrates, which of course wasn't the case at all. But nevertheless, while Erasmus is a humanist, he remains a Catholic. And he ends up having a debate with Luther on the nature of free will. And that is complicated, and I don't want to go too far into it, but I will just say this much. In his dispute with Erasmus, Luther made the case that, which is also a Calvinist principle, so this tended to be one, and you can also find it within Augustine, but it's also Augustine, there's all these contradictory ideas there about free will as well as what's called predestination. But let me just clarify what that is in the case of Luther. He says we're always in bondage to some power or other. And for him, we're always either in bondage to God or to the devil. It's a very dualistic theory, the way Luther puts it. But the insight about this, which I think is basically true, this much is true, that when we say that we're free, we're never really free from the things that we're attached to unless we disassociate ourselves from that. And in that moment of disassociation, we have a certain freedom. But as soon as we attach ourselves to something else, as soon as we serve some other power, are caught up in some other enterprise, undertake other kinds of participation in reality, all sorts of determinations start to impinge upon us. So in this sense, Luther was really onto something. But the Erasmian position, like Augustine, is that through faith and in faith, and this is not, in some ways, it's not so far from Luther, because, and many of the observers of the dispute thought they had far more in common than they had against them. But the idea is that by surrendering yourself to God, handing yourself over, it's like an aperture is open so the divine spirit comes through you. And as I said, to some extent, that's not that different from the idea of Luther about all being in bondage to someone, because if you open up yourself through faith and then through God's grace, now that's the point though, and that's the Augustine point, which brings these together. And I'm not even saying that Erasmus doesn't agree with this, but through God's grace, then you receive salvation. So faith and salvation go very much hand in hand. However, it had become quite commonplace, at least as Luther saw it within the church, to believe, and he could see this remember, Luther is living at the time that St. Peter's in Rome is being built, and these indulgences being sold, and this, for Luther, was absolutely scandalous, that people were basically selling you your salvation by you giving money so that good works could be done. And the good work was the building of the church. And what Luther is saying, look, the works don't matter. The work itself is not important. What is important is the condition of the soul, the condition of the faith that precedes the work. And that's why, for example, when you go into Luther's theology, there's one of the books in the New Testament is the book of St. James. And Luther hated that book. He called it that straw, because that is a book which suggests that works matter. That it's not only the faith, but it's through the deeds, it's through your works that you can know the character of the soul, insofar as it can be known, of course, given that God's grace is the intervening force always. So Luther then, unlike Erasmus wanted to stay with the church because he saw that there was a confessional unity that had all sorts of advantages. The church needed to clean itself up. It should get rid of the monastics. That's not a problem for Erasmus. They are scoundrels in cows, as he said somewhere. But Luther, who was an Augustinian monk, who really didn't start with the idea of setting up a new movement. That was not his intention at all. There were just certain doctrines and practices of the church that he thought were totally anathema to the spirit of Christianity, which he, like many of the other reformers, was going back to the original gospel, going back to the New Testament. Instead of believing that you should listen to how the priests interpret these doctrines in accordance with the Catholic Church, Luther is saying, no, this is a relationship between the Spirit and God. And in this sense, there's a certain kind of interiority of emphasis, or an emphasis of interiority of the spiritual condition that very much bound up with one's choice in the matter. Isn't that ironic, given the position on free will? But I won't go into that. That in that moving inward, you ultimately it's your conscience that should be decided. So any kind of extrinsic, external compulsions about faith, for Luther, they're null and void. They have no spiritual weight whatsoever. So to just go along and, in a sense, go along with the tradition you're part of, which was really the typical condition of the Christian in the medieval period. There was Mother Church. I was a member of Mother Church. Most peasants, although they would attend the various ceremonies, the masses and other holies, if I were to get a test on theology, I very much doubt if any of them would pass it, because it didn't really work that way. They weren't really learned. They didn't care. They were part of a community, and the priest was the intercessionary between God and the soul. Now, in the Protestant tradition, of course, that intermediary goes. So Luther's attack upon the church ends up ultimately being the breakdown, not only the monastic orders, but the breakdown of the way the priest class was operating. They would, and in some respects, this is also a return to older practices, they would be seen as in some way a member of a spiritual community speaking to their flock, but they had no, or speaking to the flock with the flock really, but they had no higher placement in terms of the relationship between you and God. The highest thing is your conscience, is your faith. Now, Luther writes down these 95 theses and attacks all sorts of things. He's very harsh on the scholastic philosophers, attacking St. Thomas Aquinas, and attacking indulgences, attacking a number of articles of faith that had come to be seen as intrinsic to what the faith was. And he attacks these by nailing them on the wall, and ultimately he is excommunicated in this. Now, insofar as he had positioned himself against Rome, against the orthodoxy, Catholic orthodoxy, he wasn't so different to a number of other earlier reformers. But the reason we really say the Reformation really begins, it takes off with Luther, is because of the politics surrounding that decision. And the long and the short of it is that there were certain princes in the north of Germany were actually very grateful to be able to sever their principality from the authority and basically the taxation going to Rome. So they were ready to support Luther, and instead of handing Luther over to the church in Rome, they protected him. And there was initially he would go there and debate it, but they could see that he could end up being burnt at the stake. Not that burning of the stake was, rife or happening all the time. That's a kind of myth that comes through in later period, and especially that myth is spread by Calvinists and then by Enlightenment thinkers. But it did occur, and that's a very complicated. The whole story of the Inquisition, which I haven't really gone into, let me just say, it's more complicated than the average TV documentary will lead you to believe. It's quite a complicated process, and exactly what is going on there, but we don't need to go into this. Okay, so what the princes, the tensions that were taking place between the German princes and the Habsburgs, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was really the terrestrial primary source of authority that had the backing of Rome, who was caught up in various wars against France, and who was also a political competitor with Frederick III. That was the Elector of Saxony, who became basically Luther's protector patron. There was, in a sense, the geopolitics was dictating the efficacy of, or the character and shape that the reforming ideas of Luther would play. And ultimately, this would mean that a whole lot of principalities in Germany, remember at this stage, Germany is not a country as such, it's constituted by all these principalities, and it's not until under Bismarck in the 19th century that we see a unified Germany, even though there were German-speaking people, but they didn't constitute a nation as such. So this political movement, now you also need to recall that within any territory, within any jurisdiction, in spite of Luther's claim on the emphasis of faith, if the prince or the whatever the chief authority was, decided to side with the reformers, the rest of the population were expected to do that. So there was still, even though it's all about conscience, internal conscience, and everything is the major thing, in terms of the political practice, where you were tended to dictate whether you would end up a reformer or not. Now, another thing about Luther, and in this respect, you might recall me saying that one of the interesting things about the Reformation is it unleashes something that has consequences way beyond the simple change in the church, which of course, given that Western Europe is still Christendom, but this fracturing within Christendom between the Reformist movement and the Catholic orthodoxy, one of the consequences, I said the consequences of this go way beyond the religious side of it, and the big impetus, or one of the big impetus that takes place, that transpires with Luther, is simply the massive increase in literacy. And that goes hand in hand with this idea of the priest is not the intercessionary. Everybody should be reading the Bible. Everyone should be a good Christian. Luther himself, by the way, believed that there would be very few people who were good Christians. Very few people on Judgment Day would be saved. It was a minuscule amount. And the Christian life, he says, he has this great formulation. Suffer, suffer, cross, cross. It's hard being a Christian. It's hard not to be bound up with the things of the world. And the only way you can really do it is you have to understand the Word of God. You have to read that Word of God. You have to imbibe that Word of God. You have to live by that Word of God. Now, here's another irony. On the one hand, then, we're seeing the return to the renunciative tradition, which was right at the foundation of the Christian faith. And you remember me talking about that, hopefully, when I was talking about Jesus and the apostles and the disciples, that it is primarily a renunciative religion. But with Luther, you still have to be involved in the world. So there's this kind of split that's going on as well. So whereas the monastic life had been indicative of that withdrawal from the world that had become really intrinsic then to the Catholic faith, and to a lot of, of course, not everyone is doing that, but that kind of spiritual withdrawal is seen as really of great spiritual value in God's eyes. Not only does Luther say it's not worth a cracker, but he is saying it's your participation in the world, in your heart, with your spirit, you'll put yourself in service to God. So in your profession, you are really doing God's work in that little piece of reality that you're occupying. You're occupying the post. And a profession in this Reformation sense, a profession in this sense is to profess your faith through your action. So again, remember me saying that work-faith dichotomy. You can see how it's really very complicated. It's a very grey area, but it's the kind of thing that much will hang on a formulation on the word of choice to try and accentuate these things that are, or these aspects of character, of social life, of personal character and personal life that that the faith is trying to express. So what happened then is that the monasteries and nunneries were priests and nuns were moving back into the world, going into professions, and this was really changing things very, very drastically. And when I'll mention him later, but I will mention it now. When Henry VIII, who sets up the Church of England, but that's not a reformist church, decides to do this because he wants to divorce, he follows Luther in one major respect, even though theologically he doesn't follow Luther at all, but in one respect, that is, he wants to clear out the monasteries, empty the nunneries, and basically that means that the state will be able to get hold of a lot of wealth. Now, this is obviously going to be a big appeal to any princes in those territories where there is church property. And indeed, you might recall me saying so. I think I mentioned this when I was talking about, I think I mentioned this with Thomas à Becket, how when ecclesiastical law had been developed around the 12th century, around that time, it's even a bit earlier. So there was any priest or any nun, no matter what they did, they were beholden to not crown law, but to ecclesiastical law. One of the things that was going on was this was also a way of trying to extract more resources towards the church, and this left a lot of monarchs very unhappy about this. And in England and in France, there were all sorts of attempts to try and get their hands on church property, and compromises or trying to change things to balance in their favour. But when with the reformers, there's a kind of consistency of, because now you're severed completely from Rome. Rome is seen as, and the Pope is seen as, basically a diabolical force. And you'll see all these illustrations from the reformers where Rome is really seen as the devil. And there's a reading of the book of Revelations and the 7 hills that surrounds Rome as diabolical. Roma is amor, spelled backwards. All of these kind of hostilities are being expressed by the reformers, because basically they see Rome as rotten to the core. And at that stage, Rome was really pretty squalid, and that's something that I also mentioned in an earlier lecture. Now, Luther had been supported by the princes, but it was the case that a lot of peasants saw in Luther a kind of saviour, because they mistook what his attacks upon Rome and church authority and the abuse of power by various political authorities, they interpreted that as license for them to introduce a whole set of new social relationships which would ultimately free them from any kind of feudal bondage. And again, you'll remember feudal bondage which is still there. It's not ubiquitous by any means now, because you've got far more urban centres and towns, etc. But nevertheless, any kind of bondage, they're saying, well, that won't matter anything, because the Pope now is not sealing these reciprocal rights and duties. And this led to a big outbreak of wars in Germany among the peasantry, and Luther was horrified by it, and he sided with the princes. And again, he writes this very violent text, because he basically thought revolution was the worst condition that could possibly exist. At the height of that was also an outbreak of violence by the Anabaptists, led by a guy called Thomas Müntzer. And I just don't have time to go into that, but if you read the history of communist thought, you will very often see references to Thomas Müntzer, Friedrich Engels, who I will speak about much later, or later in the semester, the co-author with Karl Marx of the Communist Manifesto. He also speaks about the peasant wars. So in the communist imagination, the peasant wars and the Anabaptist violence, the Anabaptists were a sect, a particular reformist sect, is seen as on the way, being a precursor to the socialism and communism. The other thing about Luther is there was a great elevation of the hymn and German music, and the case could be made that classical music as a practice owes a lot to the way in which the hymn and music is now appears in the German churches, or the Lutheran churches. So generally, when we look at Calvin, we'll see a stronger aesthetic. Well, I've got it over here on the right here. I say there's a major aesthetic transformation in Protestant countries. That's not so much with Luther, but in the main, the position was that Luther's position was this: look, it's okay to use pictures, but what those Catholics do is idolatry. They're worshipping the saints. They're worshipping Mary, the Mother of God. We've got to stop all that. And very often the pictures are the means, and the statues are the means by which this idolatry takes place. So he wasn't completely so-called iconoclastic, getting rid of all icons, but he was also participating in this new aesthetic, which can be summed up in a nice formulation that it's the invisible church that really matters, not the church visible. And you see this immediately in the architecture of Protestant churches and in contrast with Catholic churches. Catholic churches, they show the splendor and glory of God. We'll remember from an earlier lecture, you know, the Gothic art, the Gothic cathedrals, all of that splendor and majesty. With the Reformers, and much more so even with the Calvinists, who we'll talk about in a moment, that aesthetic moves over to a much more plain, everyday life style. The Catholics, by the way, just in terms of history of art, will react to this by doubling down and even intensifying this idea of splendor, sweep, movement, dynamism of God's power, strength, love, majesty, and grace in figurative form in that movement that we call the Baroque period. And if you're not familiar with that, just go and Google it and start looking at the grand kind of architectural design, the kind of statues, the paintings that are part and parcel of this, the Baroque. Also, as this is really also changes the nature of the university, and that's no small thing, especially in Germany, where you will recall that basically the university was essentially a clerically run institution in the Middle Ages. I hope you can hear me. I'm just got something saying this is a poor connection. I don't know why that is the case. I'll carry on. If there's any problem, you let me know. What was happening in Germany was now again, you recall, they're still the most educated people, those that have had a clerical education or church education at these higher levels. Now they become professors, and their job, again, that word, to profess the word of God through their teaching, and to then affect the different professionals. At this stage, medicine is still part of the curriculum, for example. A whole lot of modern professions aren't, but nevertheless, law and medicine are part and parcel of the training, university training. So the professor now has an important role to play. And again, you remember this is really pre modern press. So you've got the Bible in the home, you've got the professor at the university. And these are major sources of ideas, and then of course you've got various authors. So now it's not that there's no clergy, there is, but they will get married, and they are basically seen, as I said, members of a community, of a spiritual community, in a sense, leading the way in leading the ceremony, but not spiritual leaders, so to speak. What also happens with this, and you should pick this up from what I said about Henry VIII, that now the church, and especially church finances, is going to move under state control, but nation-state control. We're really speaking before nations, okay. But the embryo of the modern nation is one of the conditions of it. There's a kind of unity that is transpiring in the that occurs because you got rid of the interfering nature of Rome and its authorities. There's also some sacramental reforms, and again, if you look at the way a Protestant church is set out, where the altar sits, even the different rites and rituals, they start to differ and define themselves, and there's all sorts of theological disputes, and those disputes also occur between the different reform movements themselves. So okay, sorry. Oops. I'm not sure why this is happening. It's got smaller than I want it to be. Sorry. Okay. This should have come a bit later, but I will, now that I'm here, I'll just mention this. The other reformers that I'm going to talk about are John Calvin, and I'll go into some detail in his doctrine, and Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich. And what tends to happen is that different regions tend to get caught up within a different set of doctrinal commitments that ultimately have a political associations, a political formation that gathers around it or works in lockstep with this. And this ultimately means that the Protestants are divided amongst themselves. And in 1529, Philip of Hesse tried to get these doctrinal agreements. So try and bring the Protestants together, because you recall that, you know, the real enemy is Rome. So wouldn't it be good if all we Protestants could ultimately all see the world as one? But the problem was that often they would be just at loggerheads with each other as they were with Rome. And I mentioned Henry VIII using that schism and wanting to get a divorce to get his hand on church property, but not being a reformer. Person I'll spend a bit more time on, because it's John Calvin. And in the history of ideas and institutional transformation, I would say John Calvin and Augustine are probably two of the most important people in the development of what we now call the West. And in the case of Augustine, it's because he provided a theology which would ultimately be not uniformly by every major theologian, but largely the doctrinal position, go-to position of the theology that held the church together. And in that sense, he played a huge role also, as you will recall me talking about the different heresies that he fought, in providing a coherent body of doctrine which would hold the church together. And once the church starts to really try and centralize from the 11th century on, that's invaluable. Even though Aquinas, in many ways, as I mentioned earlier, he will break with Augustine. He's more Aristotelian, more than Platonic, Neoplatonic. He's more open to the beauty and forms of the world than Augustine, etc. The second most, or the other most important person, I think, is John Calvin, and that is because Calvin's position leads to a kind of republicanism that's not of the Machiavellian sort, of the Roman sort, but a new kind of republicanism, which will ultimately be important in the development in the United States, and then also eventually become really globally important. And not only there, also important even in the United Kingdom and in Holland. So these new kind of republics start to form, and they are largely predicated upon ideas developed by John Calvin. So this is a hugely important seismic shift in the way in which people understand the role of political life. Again, it's not like the Republican sort of Machiavelli, but what is important is like-minded conscience, a like-minded conscience of the people in the community. So to put that another way, the morals of the group really start to matter. Now you could say to some extent, isn't that what the Catholic Church was doing? You know, trying to indoctrinate everybody in the same moral sphere. But ultimately, political authority really wasn't really closely connected to that at all, apart from the rulers. The Catholic Church was not particularly interested in devising new forms of republics, even though some republics had developed. But they hadn't developed along lines that were predicated upon a certain spiritual core, a certain theological core that would ultimately dictate the intellectual or mental moves and even spiritual connections, associations of that community. Now, like Luther, he was an Augustinian. He, like Zwingli, he disagreed with Luther. And again, to put it bluntly, from the position of both Zwingli and Calvin, Luther is still too drawn in to Catholic tendencies, even though there's all sorts of differences too drawn in. The great work of Calvin is the Institutes of Christian Religions. It's a massive work. It's rigorously argued, but it's highly theologically inflected. Now, when, and a little bit later in this lecture, I start talking about the new intellectual philosophical revolution that transpires in tandem with the scientific revolution and lays the basis of what we will call the Enlightenment. One thing I really want you to notice, to really pay attention to, and it's this. If you look at the terms of reference for how Luther and Calvin, despite all their differences, if you look at the terms of references for how they talk about man and society and the political body and the meaning of life, you will see that it is all heavily biblically inflected. When we get to people like Spinoza, well, Spinoza is in some ways more difficult because he's an out-and-out atheist, but someone like John Locke, who we'll either talk about at the end of this lecture or the beginning of next week. It's often said that they are Christian. Well, kind of, but they're not Christians in the way that, so Christendom has still got a hold on Europe until well into the 19th century, but not in the same way, absolutely not in the same way as under Luther and Calvin. So here's going to be the tipping point. The tipping point will be Calvin and Luther, Zwingli. These are all, in a sense, the summation of an old world now moving in different directions, but very much predicated upon a style of thinking that owes little to the Greeks, but everything to Christendom. And when we move then to the Enlightened, we'll see a style of thinking that is essentially pagan, even though there's still going to be Christian residues. I don't doubt that, and I don't want to deny that. But the terms of reference will not primarily be biblical. If ever the Bible is invoked, and when we look at John Locke and we see his argument with Robert Filmer, yes, he reads the Bible to make points, and there's other points in Locke where he analyzes the Bible, but the analysis is ultimately, the biblical analysis is ultimately to serve a set of concepts that are not biblical in origin. They're not biblical in origin. They have to, in a sense, be twisted to be biblical in origin. They're more rationalist. And again, I'll put it this way. When we look at the thinkers of the Enlightenment, here's the decisive thing, and I'll announce this now. It's an all-important historical moment. From the position of those that see themselves as the creators of a new intellectual understanding of the world, which they do, these new philosophers, and beginning with Descartes, or some contemporaneous with Descartes, what they are saying is that the human, the understanding of things must take priority over the imagination of things. And from this position, any kind of story that is simply legend-based, as it begins to appear, that's part of the imagination. So the Bible, seen from that position, is an imaginative expression of perhaps natural phenomenon which we can understand, if we use what's called our understanding. If we use our understanding. So the word understanding will become a noun, the understanding. It will become a faculty of the mind. And the mind itself is going to be emphasized, accentuated in a way that it simply isn't when we look at Calvin or Luther, because they are concerned with the soul. And the soul is understood by them not as being equivalent, which we will see in Descartes. We'll see in Descartes the soul and the mind are one and the same. Now, no one in Christendom up until that point had ever seen the soul and the mind as one and the same. That is a radical shift of emphasis. And this is explaining, to come back to it, the central point, explaining why Calvin, Luther, Zwingli, other reformers, they're all caught up in essentially a different world in which we could say their imagination are operating in a fundamentally different way. We would call this a hermeneutical way. It's based on their referring to sacred scripture and then trying to understanding their orientation through life through that scripture. In some ways, it's much closer to the Greeks with the poets than those Greek philosophers. But if you mentally, it's similar, even though the content is obviously very different. So this, whereas once we get to Descartes and once we get to these other thinkers, we now, to put it bluntly, start moving in a much more secular kind of world. The concepts are there for a much more secular understanding of how we participate in life. And we start then to see things like freedom, equality, all the norms of modern politics, norms of values of modern political discourse. They're not from Calvin. They're not from Luther, even though without their geopolitical transformations that take place in general political transformations, without the intellectual severance from Rome, the latter could not have happened. But when the latter happens, this world starts just to become, in a sense, private. That's why today, really, religion is essentially a private rather than a public matter in the Western world. Okay, and that's what comes out of the Reformation, that it's private rather than, or it's the beginning of that with that interior of conscience. But in a more liberal world, and we'll look at liberalism, as I said, later in this lecture, when we get to a more liberal world, we're seeing a whole set of non-theological tropes, concepts such as I said, equality. So we're starting to see the self, not in hermeneutical terms anymore, not in traditional, which was the traditional term, but primarily in intellectual terms that could be understood rationally understood terms. Okay, so do bear that in mind. That's going to be a major difference. Now, Calvin was a city-state was basically centered in Geneva. It was a very religious kind of state, a theocratic state. That's the word I'm looking for. And the unfortunate Michael Servetus, who had been critical of Rome, but was also caught up in various doctrinal disputes. With the reformers, he ends up waylaying in Geneva, thinking that it'd be safe there, and he gets tried and he gets burnt for heresy in Geneva. Now, this is a really, for followers of Calvin, this is a shocking thing, because the Calvinists would always argue here is the beginning of a new kind of freedom, which is not burdened by this enforcement of conscience. Remember that, the importance of conscience. But what we see in Geneva is a practice that's identical to what had been taking place in the Middle Ages. As I said, it's often exaggerated the extent to which it happened, but the persecution of heretics. And ultimately, if a heretic would not recant, then they could be burned at the stake. Okay. Now, unlike in Luther, the aesthetic of the Calvinists was far starker. Church with white walls, there's no paintings at all. The psalms are chanted rather than having any music. The instruments are banned from church. So you can see it's a very austere kind of community that's being set up. Now, another thing, and again, this goes right back to the foundation of Christianity. And indeed, at different times, you may recall me pointing out that the church and state, their distinction at different times is being martial, but at other times they tend to get so close. But of course, the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, they were never the same. They weren't the same beings. So there was this idea of delegation of office, and at different times, because of the conflict between the two, again, you might recall me talking about Dante, there's a need for some writers think there's a need to spell out what the limits of papal authority are, because they kept exceeding those limits. Anyway, but the idea is they should be different, but they should also cooperate, because you're a community of Christians. So there's a sense in which, although the state should obey the church, civil government must ensure, and civil government must ensure that God is not blasphemed. So if you like, there's a certain religious moral texture that spreads through the state. The holding of the offices should be different. Another thing about the people in Geneva, I mentioned their austerity, and taverns were closed under Calvin. And if you recall the play by Shakespeare, Twelfth Night, where the Puritan Malvolio is being mocked in that play, very much so. One of the characters in the play says, "Do you think, Malvolio, because you are pure, that there will be no more capes and ale?" So there's a perception about the Calvinists that basically they are. It's too strict. It's too stringent. It's just not very worldly. And I must say, if I think of Catholic countries now, like, still very predominantly Catholic countries, two spring to mind, the Philippines and Mexico, which kind of socially are, and you compare them to countries that have gone through the Calvinist moment and then now been secularized, you can see that the kind of building up of Calvinist and then secularization of this. You can see that there's absolutely nothing puritanical about Catholic Mexico or Catholic Philippines. They're kind of out of control in terms of the manners. Not that they don't have their own manners. They do. They're societies of manners, but nothing like the Puritan manners. A very different modus operandi. Anyone who's been to either of those places, I think, will see at a glance. And in part, that's because in some ways, in spite of the church, the role of the church, the church never really succeeded in Catholic countries in entering into the interior conscience of people in the way that the Calvinists succeeded. And in part, I think that's also just a whole set of theological tendencies and emphases that are part and parcel of the Catholic Church. Although Again, although Calvinism emphasizes original sin, as does the Catholic Church, I think the sinful character is more likely to be accepted in its play out in the Catholic Church than in the Calvinist Church. And one way you can see this, by the way, is in the main, not wasn't always the case, but in the main, the practice of confession within Catholicism was a private matter between you and the priest, where with the Calvinists you were confessing really to the community, not just to God but to the community. So it was a public matter. So in a sense, this idea of the transparency of your heart and soul to other members of the community that are also acting in service to God, this starts to take off in Calvinism. And if I think now of the practice of, if someone says something that we consider morally reprehensible, say someone says something racist or something, and now it gets in the paper, someone who's no one says something, racist, and the whole community and the journalists feel that we're compelled to know this and to censor this person. This is very much a Calvinist mindset, or post facto. It's a post-Calvinist, but it's a kind of mentality that really comes out of the Calvinists. I mentioned predestination and election, and that's very important too. But one of the things about the Calvinists is that although they agreed that no one could know who was saved, that was a big emphasis, that they were predestined for it, that there was the church of the saints, and that was really being represented within the community. You were never quite sure if someone was absolutely there or not, but their presence in the community, and to some extent their success in the community, could be a sign of God's favouring of them. So there's this sense of a kind of those favoured by God, these elect. And again, although you can find that within Christian doctrine, if you look at Catholic societies, that was really not really part of the general fabric of how people think, even though some people, might have made the case that you should think that way about the monastics and the cleric. It really wasn't, because again, we see that all sorts of criticisms being made of clerics, of popes, throughout Catholic Christendom. Now, the program of Calvin's, of this Puritan state, this kind of republic, a new style of republic. So he's very anti-aristocracy, he's very anti-monarchy. It would be vital in shaping the Netherlands. It would be very influential in England, especially Scotland, and that would precipitate both, first of all, when the Calvinists in England, the Puritans in England, were being persecuted, because remember, England is Anglican, but Scotland had become so Calvinist that the English were, by demanding that they use prayer books that weren't of their own kind, trying to impose alien prayer books onto the Scots. Ultimately, this was a moment that helped be one of the sparks of what would become a civil war. So the American founders and the English Civil War, all in some way, important ways, happened because of Calvinism. Another aspect of Calvinism, and this is emphasized in a famous book called Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Max Weber, this great German sociologist, argued it's the seed of modern commercial society. Because he says, economic activity and participation to try and make the world better, the worldly things better, idle money becomes a sin. He says this is really part of the Protestant ethic. Now, that has been disputed, because it's clearly the case that there were successful commercial republics prior to the Calvinists and the Reformers in those Italian city-states. Nevertheless, it's something worth considering. And what we do notice, by the way, is if you open a map of Europe and you note where the Protestant church was stronger, and then you look at where the Catholic Church is situated, and then if you look at the Orthodox Church as well, you'll see that the wealthiest nations were all Protestant. That's not so much now, but then again, the Christendom is in crisis in Western Europe anyway. So there's also a zeal to illustrate the glory of God, but not by showing the majesty in a painting or anything, but just in your daily life. There's lots of, it's very disciplined life. And you can be kicked out of the community. So you're basically focusing on it. You're morally training people to be members of your community. I've said all this. I've said this. The elected council should appoint people to have an eye on everyone and report notable vice. So it's much more intrusive, socially intrusive. Which is another way of saying that, though, it is much more focused upon people creating bonds of solidarity around a very much more stricter interpretation of things. Again, and they should get that, and that interpretation will ultimately, it'll keep going back to the Bible. Children are to be instructed at home, but then examined by their ministers. Now, I said when I said he was very anti-aristocratic, he did recognise if you could find an aristocratic of the faithful with your political community, that's a good thing, as opposed to the old style aristocracy. So in that sense, it's a mixed government. But the new aristocracy that he favours is like those people in Geneva. The taxes should belong to the community as a whole, and hence social welfare. Very anti-monarchical. Now, so in England, you've got the predominance of Anglicanism, but Calvinism and Puritanism is making its way down through Scotland. And then, because there was no Reformation in England, they will be ultimately trying to change the spiritual character of Great Britain, and this will play a part in the Civil War. It's not the only thing, but it's an important part in the Civil War. I'll speak about that a bit later, because I want to come back. I want to go first through this, and then I want to come back and talk about the roots of liberalism, and that matters a lot. But there were wars through these different groups, and between these different groups all throughout Europe. And at different times, France, for example, was plagued by these wars throughout much of the 16th century and even going into the 17th century. In the middle of the 16th century, a book that's one of the earliest novels and a great piece of national literature of the French, written by a Catholic monk. But again, that saying he's a Catholic monk doesn't mean he's particularly religious. For many people, being a monk or having a position in the church was a job. It was a career opportunity, because the opportunities were very limited in the kinds of things you could do in this world. And Rabelais ultimately mocks all sides in the religious wars. And there's one very famous chapter in his book, Gargantua and Pantagruel. Though the name of the book is based on the major characters, two giants. One predominates in the first book, and then the second one we see Pantagruel and his merry men. And they're giants, and basically the point that Rabelais is saying is, if we could eliminate all the worst things about tradition, and there's a number of instances, even though Rabelais scholars don't always say this, and I strongly disagree with them on this, he's basically showing that Christianity diminishes us. And if we just did what we will, that's the formulation. That's a variant of the Augustinian formulation. Augustine says, love God and do what thou wilt. Rabelais just says, do what thou wilt. You can see the omission of love God from that formulation just changes the nature of everything. And in this famous chapter, he has a war between what he calls the sausage eaters and the fish eaters. And the fish eaters are the Catholics, because on certain fast days they're not allowed to eat meat. And the sausage eaters, or the chitterling eaters, are the Protestants that can eat meat every day of the week. And in that just for Rabelais shows the madness of this kind of world. I think Rabelais is one of the earliest people to lay down in literary form a secular vision of the kind of world he would like to bring about. Now, with all these conflicts that were going on, now, a lot of these conflicts, you must bear in mind, anyone who's doing with me the revolutions course will also go into much more detail about the religious war, will know that what was tending to happen is that once a community had become one way or the other, so it wasn't just the prince. If the prince or the duke or whatever the stature was, or the count or whatever, in his particular territory, if there was a large membership body of a community sharing a certain faith, in most times it would just be so much easier for the leading principal power just to adopt that faith and protect that faith. So a lot of the conflicts was about the character of different communities, and then communities also fighting each other, helping out their brothers, so to speak, their brothers and sisters in other territories. So, as I said, these wars were really horrific, and they really culminate in what's called the 30 Years' War. Before that, there's attempts to try and mediate. Charles V and Lutherans had come up with the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. The famous formulation was, whose realm, his religion. So it means follow your boss. But as I said, very often the boss would be following the community. But by then it's got to just say, follow the boss. That's how we're going to settle these problems. But it didn't really last. In the middle of in the middle part of the second half of the 16th century, there was the St. Bartholomew's massacre and the expulsion of the Huguenots. It was followed by that. The Huguenots were the French Calvinists. So from Geneva, it spread out into big sections of southern France. And the St. Bartholomew's massacre was orchestrated by the University of Paris. And the University of Paris had been the leading hegemonic power in the training of upper theologians and the highest levels of the clergy who were being educated. So it was really that, in a way, this is all about who gets to control the university system. And so all these jobs that are part and parcel of the university system, and the narratives that are to be circulated, and the practices and rituals and rites and rituals that are to be circulated in that world. It's all very practical. But as I said, the university and Catholic clerics played a big part in this massacre, in which a couple of thousand people were killed. That would linger on in French memory and burn a hole very deep in French memory, as would the attack on the Huguenots. And ultimately, too, the way that Louis XIV basically used the Jesuits, this is a bit later, used the Jesuits to try and consolidate his power against Protestant tendencies. And those tendencies also affected the Catholic Church with the movement called the Jansenist movement, which was Catholic ostensibly, but in terms of doctrine, much closer to the Protestants. And in siding with the Jesuits had really were born in Spain and by Ignatius Loyola, and they were basically trying to serve the church to counter the Reformation. And the role of this group, these Jesuits, so they were basically doing Rome's work, even though they'd begun in Spain. And they were seen as really hostile to various national interests. Now, in the case of Louis, as I said, he used the Jesuits against the Jansenists, but ultimately this would be a very bad strategy and create a lot of animosity towards the Jesuits, who would eventually be expelled from France. Now, I said there was a culmination of these religious wars in what we call the 30 Years' Wars, which really, at the time, no one thought they were in something called the 30 Years' War. It was just a whole bunch of wars. It was primarily sparked by disputes around property ownership of previous church property, and that is basically the Holy Roman Emperor was supporting forces that wanted to get the church property back from those hands that had captured it with the Reformation. But as the war developed, there were all sorts of alliances. So it wasn't just a Catholic versus Protestant dispute. And as I mentioned earlier, the Calvinists would often be fighting Lutherans and different sects fighting each other. And it took on a dynamic of its own. Great Britain, by the way, was able to avoid that war, but it wasn't affected by that war. And ultimately what comes out of the 30 Years' War is what's called the Treaty of Westphalia, and that is the beginning of the idea that the sovereign territory has to be recognized and accepted under international law. So this is a sort of first steps to a kind of international order taking place in Western Europe, an international order in which you recognize sovereign territorial boundaries. So that's one of the things that comes out of this. And also Great Britain, which had avoided the Reformation by, in a sense, taking the bits it wanted, developing Anglicanism, which was basically Catholicism without Rome. So old rites and rituals, but clergy then beholden to the king. The crown becomes head of the church. And this is basically a ticking time bomb. And there would be the War of the Three Kingdoms between England, Scotland and Ireland taking place in 1651. Now, I'm going to come back to that war because it's going to be important. But now, I want to focus upon this. Remember I said this tipping point, and it's the scientific revolution. So I've already prefigured this in the last hour, and some things I'll... Now, the thing I want you to bear in mind is I think that the horror of the religious wars basically showed a deep problem within Christendom. That it wasn't just that it was different faiths, it was that Europe, much of Western Europe, had been experiencing such a scale of violence in which religion had been implicated because of the religious wars, and that there was a new type. There's a reaction to this. So there's a reaction to this, and that reaction is basically the formation of a new type. Now, note two different things here. On the one hand, you are developing a way of seeing the world in which biblical, figurative hermeneutics, the interpretive understanding of the world through that book, is seen as a failure. That trying to bring all the reformers to get everyone on the same page is not working. And if you think about the Bible, you'll realize, well, it's a very, very big book. And there's all these different, and in terms of just reading material, you can see the various elements as such. But it's not surprising that once you've got rid of a kind of centralized, authorial way of reading that book, or authoritative way of reading that book, it's going to be, this group and that group. In a sense, the Reformation becomes an infinite schismatic moment, which is exactly what the church wished to avoid. And I think the smarter people in the church, like Erasmus, could see that that would be the case. They foresaw this. So that's one side. So, but the way it originally mounts is, it just happens to be through science. So it is a scientific revolution, then gives birth to a metaphysical revolution. So in and of itself, the scientific revolution is just certain developments in thinking about physical bodies, especially physical bodies, and the stars. And the first insights that are going to come into play in ultimately what will be a larger body of ideas to how to think about the world, which will then have the impact of displacing the power of the biblical view of the world, because now, even though in practice, as we've seen, it's not playing out this way, but now the religion can be internal, but we're trying to understand the external world. And the external world, the question is, what are its laws and properties? So, in trying to understand this, what will be again the tipping point from the scientific revolution? And that's, if you like, that's the major axis of rethinking. But it will be a new kind of metaphysics, a new set of principles to think about reality to court, in which thinking about reality will require, first of all, thinking about the physical world, getting that right, but then also starting to think about the moral world and the world of the beautiful, the world of art. And that's the third thing that really comes along. And you can see there's actually a sequence in the development of Enlightenment thinking. And then they'll start also, maybe even a bit early, but this idea of where does history fit in, this starts to take on a set of questions. And I'll touch on some of this. Okay, so first of all, the other thing is that relates to this is that although there had been various scientific discussions within the university, and some of it precedes these characters, Nicolaus Copernicus, Tycho Brahe, and Johannes Kepler, and Copernicus is famous for the heliocentric view of the world as opposed to the geocentric, that is, the planets revolve around the sun, and not the planets are revolving around the Earth, which is the centerpiece. Now, the teaching that had although some people had argued that was already the case, and that had been within operating out of universities, I won't bother going into the name, but just let you know that it happened. At this moment, historically, where the church now is facing all sorts of other contestations due to the Reformation, this idea is seen as one more thing in which the Aristotelianism that had been the centerpiece, remember Aristotle's a pagan, but had been the centerpiece of a scholarly, of an education in theology and philosophy, and weird in theology. Remember, amongst the 95 Theses of Luther, it's Aristotle he attacks. What has Aristotle got to do with the church? Nothing. Whereas what theologians had been accepting ever since Aristotle had moved his way into the university, with some initial opposition, but from about the time of the 11th century, about 12th century, was that Aristotle, the idea was that he would provide a broader philosophy, and then we enter into theology. But the philosophy, Aristotle, you recall, was the... Now, Aristotle was, as I've said much earlier, was an absolute genius, but he was a bit of a turkey, excuse my French, when it came to physics. And his basic, and that's largely because his way of understanding the world and things in the world was very biologically based. So he'd look at form and structure. You recall me saying that from the earlier lectures. Form and structure. But when you're looking just at physical bodies, qua physical bodies, that is a useless way to do things. And the study of the planets was the first real insight into trying to penetrate laws of motion of just moving bodies. And Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler, and as I said, Copernicus, they're all astronomers. So the initial insight is made by looking at the heavenly bodies. But then the next step Again, there's a whole cluster of people doing this, but the most famous of them was Galileo Galilei. And of course, he ends up repeating and has to recant because now he gets taken to task for supporting the view of the heliocentric universe. And he has to recant on that. And he's censored them, which he does, but under his breath, it's reported to have said, he said, but it moves. Talking about the Earth around the sun. So, now Galileo, first of all, deeply opposed to Aristotle. And in his work, you can also see, which was not uncommon at this time, there's a revival of Platonism. So Plato is seen, because Plato had argued that number is inbuilt into the universe. So to put that another way, and as Galileo will formulate it, the laws of nature are written in number. Plato had said that. Aristotle thought that was impossible. He thought that's to require that something be applied that's inappropriate to what we're studying. And for Aristotle, you always have to appreciate the materials you're dealing with. And so this is indifferent to the material. But in some ways, the whole reason that you're able to apply the book of number, to read nature as a book written in number, is because you're indifferent to those morphological features. All you're interested in is body in motions. And you're just trying to see the world through the different, ultimately it'll come down to this, primary qualities, essential parts or particles that constitute the different movements of things, the attractions of things, ultimately the behavior of things, which are the laws, which are the natural laws. And those laws, it doesn't matter what kind of body, for example, it doesn't matter whether I drop a cat, a dog, or an elephant from a building and watch it fall, the rate of its fall can be measured in identical terms according to a formula. Now that's Galileo's position. It's taking on board the identification of planetary motions, which are also operating according to mathematical formulae, which both Bray and Kepler had realized. Now, in the case of Galileo, he was certainly, there were certain social conditions, Italian trade, wealth, the Renaissance sensibility generally. There was a humanistic emphasis upon experience. And he wanted to study things like projectiles. So the developments in military weapons was also a part of it. So in a sense, Galileo is woven into the fabric of his time. But this social fabric is, you can see, it's totally different to what Aristotle lived in. It's a very different world. And in this different world, Galileo comes up with is intensifying the idea that the book of nature is written in number, and the way to understand nature is to do certain kind of experiments where we bracket out, we block out all sorts of specific features as irrelevant. As I said, whether it's a cat or a dog being dropped from a building, the catness and the dogness doesn't matter. All that matters is the mass and acceleration and the force that unleashes. Okay. It's in this time too that a new vision of God is being called into question, and this is called deism. And it's really the historical link between the Reformation and the secular atheism, but in a sense it's the breaching with the Reformation. Now, I'll just briefly mention that apart from the philosophers we're looking at, there were other spiritual movements like the Rosicrucians that taught this, and another group called the Freemasons also taught a doctrine that was essentially deist. And they're all, one and all, ecumenical. What do I mean by that? That is, they're looking for a God who is not going to be doctrinally divided. Not doctrinally divided. And then as we go into it, we'll see the philosophers are looking for a God that fits the understanding or our rational capacity. That means as we will see. There'll be all sorts of explanations to this. So this is the God of philosophers. Now, why do they care about why have God? Remember, we're in a culture in which God's purpose and our purpose is so intertwined that, in a sense, if you had nothing to say about God, people would really, why aren't you talking about that? It's something everybody expected. At the same time, we see that there's this new, when I say in metaphysics, I mean these general overarching principles which enable us to understand the real as real. What is real? And given that the natural sciences have disclosed to us that the way things are and the way they look are not one and the same thing. That was Aristotle's problem. He believed that there are warm bodies, there's heavy things and there's light things. He classified objects in terms of their morphology, in terms of the forms. This idea, though, that you have natural laws that are basically can be reduced to pre-morphological characteristics, bodies in motions, and the motion, the speed of motion and the mass of the body. This just gets rid of all of that surface world, so to speak. That surface world, the world that we see, again, some of this really resonates with Platonism. The world that we see is really quite misleading, because we don't see the properties that make this world the way they are. The only way to understand the properties of this world is to study them through particular forces at work and the bodily motions at work. So we're not interested in light things, heavy things, warm things, moist things. We're not interested in grouping things that way. That's the old Aristotelian way. We're looking for a kind of continuity of forces and to understand the nature of these forces. Now, insofar as we want the universe to be stable so that we can have laws, there is still a role for lawfulness, and lawfulness is seen as what comes from God. So the first, whatever it is that creates the lawfulness, is really something that we need to invoke. We have to invoke that. So if we go to the next question, how come there are laws? We'll say because it's a law-ordained order. And that's what ultimately God is that God is the provider of this, of nature, the creator of nature, is the provider of this law-ruled, in a sense, matrix of reality. And this also starts to work in terms of two ways. So it's source of creation and also moral character, moral goodness. These very early on are seen as intrinsic to each other. Now, this idea that God is a being, that's scholastic. That proceeds, and you'll often see it said that Descartes is really just continuing this with the scholastics, which would mean that he's very much like an Aristotelian. And he writes a book called The Meditation, in which he presents himself as if he were a scholastic. He's appealing to the scholastic. Why? Because he knows all the universities that are teaching physics, which is what really interests him, that they are all being staffed by Aristotelians, people who talk Aristotle day and night, think if Aristotle said it, it must be true. And he wants to present his new doctrines as if they were able to fit, if they were congruent with certain ideas about the spirit and philosophy and nature of things that could fit Aristotle. Now, in fact, so there's a whole lot of people write books on this who take Descartes at face value. There's another lot of people, of which I include one, that think when we come to Rene Descartes, we see that what he's really doing is so drastically different to Aristotle and the scholastics that he's basically trying to befuddle his opponents, because his system of physics, his view of the world itself, his metaphysics, his first principle, was being wildly attacked. Now, I'm going to get to the specifics of Descartes in a moment. I've already anticipated a few things, but I just want to say more generally as I come back to deism, the thing that we notice is, so first of all, the new physics ends up raising all sorts of questions about reality that then has an impact on the kind of questions we'll ask about the source of creation, which means that we'll put to God. And what we notice is that although there's very different content by the different philosophical aspirants to provide, or the different aspirants to provide a new philosophy, which will be the philosophy for everyone to follow. And they include René Descartes, Gottfried Leibniz, my favourite, but I don't have time to go into him, Baruch Spinoza, who was an excommunicated Jew, and John Locke and Isaac Newton. And Isaac Newton would be seen as the pinnacle of the science of evolution, until at least the greatest scientist after him would be Einstein, and then perhaps in some of the quantum mechanics guys. But that's a later development, and by that stage, the society has been radically transformed. But you can see they all have a different religious background. You know, Descartes was a Catholic, ostensibly. He spent most of his life in Protestant countries. Leibniz, a Lutheran. Spinoza was an excommunicated Jew, and he was the most obviously atheistic of them. John Locke and Isaac Newton were Anglicans, but you can see they're ecumenical. But their God is all the same God, even though there's different little features in the metaphysics being accentuated. Essentially, there's an agreement about this God. This is the God that sets down laws. And by setting down laws, by saying this is the way the universe is because it's been ordained that way, now we can get to work on refining its laws, its mathematical character, and doing the expense. You will also notice about this God that prayers are meaningless, as is the need for the most archaic kind of manifestation of the relationship between human beings and their gods, and this is not particularly Christian. And in many ways, there's lots of things about Christianity that have infinitely more in common with tribal religions, indigenous religions, and various other pagan religions than they have with this secular world. Obviously, there's differences as well, but there's some fundamental features in which the idea of sacrifice, even though the revolution, of course, as we point out, God sacrificed his son, sacrifices himself, that's a big change, but nevertheless, it's a sacrificial order. This new way of thinking is a God that doesn't require, demand sacrifice. In fact, you can't have a conversation with this God. This God is just a being. There's no point praying to him. And Blaise Pascal, who was a Jansenist philosopher, a great scientist. People that study computers, they're still aware of a program called Pascal. He had done work on other works in science, I think on pumps and just on vacuums. That's what I'm looking for. So he was a great scientist of his day. He really, wanted science to develop, but he was a very devout Jansenist Christian, and he used to wear a sackcloth piece in which he had written on it, fire, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, none of the philosophers and the scholars. And that's a great formulation of someone who is still got a commitment to that biblical figurative world and that biblical God, who is nevertheless a scientist, because basically I'll think, look, it doesn't matter what. Yes, we do want to understand the laws of nature, but that doesn't mean that we then have all these new discoveries about the nature of God. The nature of God is revealed. It's not thought out. It's not rationalistically thought out. With all these people here and others, there's a whole set of others, Malebranche and George Berkeley and many others. They're all basically figuring God out with their mind, because what they share with God is this emphasis upon the mental and the understanding, mental in terms of mind. So this view of God, in a sense, it's a new theology. It's called a rational theology. It's got nothing in common. Remember that word hermeneutical? It's got nothing in common with the hermeneutical view of life, and it really changes the way in which people speak about the highest and most important thing. And it raised the question of what actually is the highest. Now I'm going to move to Descartes. Of all these characters, later I'll come back to Locke. And I'd love to talk about Spinoza and Leibniz in depth, but there's just not enough time in this course. If it was a history of philosophy course, I would do that. But this is broadly a history of ideas course in which politics is central to it, but I'm also trying to give you an idea of the social changing state and how that occurs, and hence to understand the political as an outgrowth and as a response to all these other features. Now, we'll turn up. The reason I mentioned Descartes is because he is really the first one to lay down the new metaphysics. The other characters I mentioned, they strongly disagree with Descartes about the character of the metaphysics, but they agree with him on such fundamentals that those fundamentals strike me as more important than their differences. And the most fundamental thing is they are really seeking an explanation for all the features of human life and the nature of the Godhead, which we can understand and hence the mind, the human understanding, is re-elevated in a way that it hadn't been since the philosophers, the Greek philosophers, had done. Because the whole biblical tradition, it basically sees the soul as more important than the mind, and God is more important than either. In this new world, God only really matters insofar as it is mind, and the mind itself only, God is an idea. It'll be an innate idea, as René Descartes argues, insofar as it is an idea of reason, an idea of the understanding. Stage the difference between the understanding and reason is not that great. Later that will be, but we don't need to go into that this morning. Now, first of all, Descartes was a Catholic, but he spent most of his life in Protestant countries because he was being attacked by the Aristotelians. As I said, and he says, I advance like a comedian behind a mask. He actually says this. So he's very aware. And in another letter to one of his followers, he said, look, we must pour new wines into our bottles. He could see that the institutional configuration of Europe was such that his ideas were really radical. There are all sorts of radical implications beyond just the study of nature, even though he restricted himself to the study of nature and a little bit of metaphysics. And he said somewhere, I spent nearly all year, working on physics, but a day or so in the year thinking about metaphysics. But the metaphysics actually supports his view of nature. But what it doesn't do, and I'll stress this, it doesn't lead you to a way to become closer to God in a relationship. It's got nothing to do with that. Now, one of the key things that we will note about Descartes is, first of all, what he wants to achieve. What does he want to achieve? And it's not just to understand the way things are in and of itself. And so many people teach first year, because if you did a first year philosophy course, you would learn about Descartes. And I've seen so many people discuss Descartes without coming back to what's he wanting. And they just think he's doing a set of philosophical puzzles, he's trying to solve them for the sake of solving them. He's so dedicated to the, well, that's not right. Basically, he wants to, and he says it very clearly in the discourses on method, he's wanting to find ways to alleviate the burdens of human labour, to create especially medicines that can help us prolong our life, perhaps even allow us to live forever. He implies this. And he wants a life that's more pleasurable and less painful. And the word he uses is comfort. Comfort. He's wanting a comfortable life. Now, I want you to note this. If, with the possible exception of, in some ways, the Epicureans, who, remember, I mentioned them, I think, in passing. The Epicureans, so they came into existence about 3 centuries before Christ. They come out of the Greek world, but then they impact upon the Roman world. They're an important philosophical sect, which doesn't mean that they had millions of followers or anything like that, but they left their stamp, so to speak, on other people that were educated, knew of the Epicureans. But the Epicureans wanted a life of apatheia. So that was a kind of, which we get the word apathetic, but that was a life also that would be more pleasurable and less painful. But the way that was sought was through basically not extending over exaggerating the importance of the over following, if you like, the following too much the appetites. Now that's not what Descartes is about. Descartes is looking for comfort. In this, he's a very modern person. If you think of, if we measure human improvement by looking at increased purchasing price parity, for example, one way of doing this. Which, and if you look, you can draw up now on Google, you can find out comparative purchasing price parity, comparative gross domestic product, to get an idea of the wealth, the general wealth of each nation and the average wealth spread throughout the country. That's very Cartesian-like. That's very utilitarian. And that utilitarianism will ultimately, it's not so much in Descartes, but ultimately find its way in to become a philosophy in its own right, and that will very much be at the basis of modern economics. Because modern economics will ask the question, what is the utility of something? And we favour this rather than that. And the overall utility is the overall wealth that is being produced and so forth. That's very, very much part of data. So, and just as we note this, how radically different this is to the Christian view of salvation. It's got nothing to do with salvation. It's a completely redirecting one's passions, one's appetites, one's behaviours. No wonder the more religiously minded at that time would attack Descartes, even though I'll say straight out, he would also instantly pick up a whole set of really quite religious people following him, who thought the only way to really save the church was bringing his philosophy into the theology of the church. But initially that was not the case, and I won't follow through on that, because that does give a more complicated picture than I want to give here, but I want to really draw attention to you to these major decisive shifts. When you can see the shifts, then you're in a position to be able to make comparisons, the bigger kind of comparisons that we're trying to make throughout this course. Now, another thing about Descartes, and this follows on very much from the idea of the kind of work Galileo was doing and the astronomers were doing, he basically puts it in the formulation of all of nature is a machine. Everything is basically bits and pieces in motion. And he differentiates, as does Galileo, between primary and secondary qualities. And he also argues that nature can be reduced to figure and number. Now, the value of this is enormous. It's great. Because what you're wanting to do is observe relationships between bodies. And if you can depict them in a pictorial manner, then you'll be able, that is to say, you've got geometry. And if you can render that geometry as number, which is what, and you might remember from grade 4 or 5 mathematics, when you learn analytical geometry, you have the x-axis and the y-axis, and you draw some figure, and then you'll be able to figure out the numerical value of the figure. This is And Descartes is seen as an important contributor to the development of analytical geometry, and he writes a book basically on this. This is trying to pin down ways in which to mathematize nature. Now, in the main, not a lot of Descartes' work is that quantifiable, not that mathematical. But you'll see in his works on optics and what's the other word? Meteorology. They're the two, besides the analytical geometry, they're the two other major areas in which he did experiments. You can see all these little figures on the pages, and basically what he's doing in terms of what we're saying about the understanding and the imagination, he's coming up with models, imagined models, but which conform to the inquiry of the understanding. So the understanding is trying to map out, using the imagination, it's trying to map out the little laws that are in operation. And then if you can build up all those laws, then you will be able to understand reality. So he recognizes, like I said about Galileo, nature is deceptive. And at one point he says, look, we've got to have this, what he calls a hyperbolic doubt. We have to doubt every kind of knowledge that we can have. Everything may be, let's say it was an illusion. It was created by an evil demon. How would we find certainty? And then he argues, well, of one thing I can be certain. I am a thinking being. And if I am thinking, that means I must exist. So now this is a variation on an argument that we find in Augustine. But the purpose to which Augustine is making that argument is ultimately to quickly deliver yourself over to God. Whereas what we find in Descartes is going into the ego, going into this, and the ego now in Descartes being the mind, you start looking for rules that the mind can supply to understand nature. Note this, so you've got certain procedures, and with those procedures, you can then therefore dispel the occlusion or the deceptive character of nature. You can dispel it by looking at things methodologically. That's why he writes a book called Discourse on Method. And another book he writes is called Rules for the Direction of the Mind. So those rules and method, they're all really bound up together. So this is the breakdown. I'm just going to quickly go through this. The Cartesian method wants to reduce everything to its simplest part. And this method, by the way, has been enormously influential, even by people who have never heard of Descartes or may think that they know enough Descartes to criticize him for his dualism. I'll get to that in a moment, because that's often criticized but not well understood, more often falsely understood when the criticism, because so much of modern thinking, modern way of doing things, including even what I see in management theory or various memos coming out from university management in today's world, it's very Cartesian-like. And and other philosophers will see this as very tyrannical. Let me say this, and I do think it's a very limited way to understand things. But at its time, it was hugely important. Pretty sad that people still just want to go back to it as if that still explains everything. Kind of pathetic, but I won't go into that. I was saying what we need to do is break everything down into the simplest elements, and we have to see everything as a cause and effect. So here's this idea of body impacting upon body impacting upon body. Now, one of the things this would do, I'm just jumping ahead a little bit, but that would mean that the doctrine of gravity, which was discovered by, or the idea of gravity as laid out by Isaac Newton, is seen by the followers of Descartes as mad. At the same time, because what's happening with the Newtonian model, you've got a planet and you've got a speck of dust, and each is attracting the other, but of course the planetary mass is so much greater that it's insignificant what the dust pulling on the Earth. But the Earth pulling upon the dust will gravitate towards the Earth is. But there's no actual impetus, mechanical impetus, that's causing that. Let's call that attraction at a distance. And this was something that befuddled a whole generation or number of generations of scientists. Whereas the Cartesian explanation was all these little things in motion bouncing around and influencing each other. The problem was you couldn't see them. The problem was it wasn't really any better than Aristotle. Remember, the argument is that Aristotle's just making things up. He's looking at forms and structures. Well, Descartes is seen as making things up. He wants an explanation. And Newton cuts that. He just says, look, I can't explain why there's action at a distance. I can show you that there is action at a distance, and I can give you the formula to prove it. But don't ask me to give you the metaphysical explanation for it, because it's not necessary. I don't deal in hypotheses, is what Newton said. And that's really directed at the followers of Descartes. So over time, it'll be argued that Descartes is a rationalist and the Newtonians are empiricists. And rationalists, by saying that, they're saying he just makes everything up with his mind, whereas the empiricists are people that study the things in nature. Now, that's very simplistic, and it's not really true. Descartes was really an observer of human phenomena, but the natural phenomena, and doing all these models. But the problem was that he was a little bit exaggerating his contribution, in a sense. He was adding things to try and make it fit, and they didn't add up. So ultimately, and what you want to do in experimental science is not add things that you don't need to. You want to, what's the law is called Occam's razor. Keep everything as simple as possible. So he's saying, break everything down into the simplest parts. Get rid of what Aristotle, remember Aristotle's four-way theory of causality, form, matter, purpose, and efficient cause. Well, he says, get rid of all that. Get rid of the final and formal causes and the material causes. Should have put material there as well. Only look at the efficient cause. What impacts upon something? That's all we need. Now, he also says, and this is one of the most misunderstood pieces of Descartes, so that's why I'm going to carry on, and say both Spinoza and Thomas Hobbes, who were going to mainly look at the political in terms of his politics, but we have to say Hobbes only comes up with his view of politics because of the changes to understanding of nature that people like Descartes and the physicists have come up with. But what Hobbes couldn't abide, what Spinoza couldn't abide, is Descartes arguing that there's two substances. This is his dualism. There's two irreducible substances. And both Hobbes and Spinoza say, look, this is crazy. What you're saying is that the brain is not physical, and that the brain doesn't influence the mind, and that how can we make this distinction? And basically, so you can't see a mind. All of this is just body. You can't see a mind. Descartes' point is very different. And although there's a correspondence even between him and Hobbes, you can see they're speaking of cross purposes. But matters are complicated by the fact that Descartes wants to preserve the language of the soul because of the social environment in which he's participating in, and his desire to have his teachings accepted and acceptable. And he knows that if he's denying the immortality of the soul, whereas basically in Spinoza and Hobbes, well done if you can find anything defending that, they just avoid it. They really avoid it. Whereas, and mess around, you know, if they touch upon it, it's all nonsense, really. But in Descartes, he wants to present an argument for the immortality of the soul. But what he ends up doing, he's redefining the soul as the mind, so it's crazy, because it's not a soul anymore. It's not a moral, sensate continuum after death, or it's not some kind of bearer of the conditions of the imprints of your life, which then have gone on. And so it's not a new spiritual body, so to speak. It's what he calls a thinking substance that consists of the cognitive or epistemic or functions. They're just functions of the mind, and he calls them willing. When you go yes or no, no, I won't accept that, I will accept that. Sensing is we just have a sense of something. We can perceive it, immediately perceive it, sort of smell it, or touch it. Imagining, that's what you draw up the models with, or you go deranged with if you start believing in the fairy tales of the Bible. He doesn't say that, but that's the implication. You can see that if you apply principles, that must be the implications. And the understanding, that's when you, which is all the rules of the mind, is operating with the understanding. So the mind is basically what gives you the rules for studying nature. And if you ask the question, well, you should be able to see immediately that in this sense, Descartes' absolutely right. The mind cannot be reduced to, now Descartes says the body is an extended thing. He gives it a very simple definition. It's the extended thing. So that means all bodies, remember cat, dog, falling from a height in Galileo, they're just bodies. And the bodily thing about it is simply, according to Descartes, Leibniz, by the way, will argue against this view, and he'll have good arguments against it, but this view becomes pretty widely accepted amongst philosophers, is just a body is simply an extended substance. Now, if I were to ask, what type of extension does an inference have? What type of extension does a syllogism have? What type of extension does the method I must follow in order to observe nature have? You realise, hang on, you can't, that's mad. That's the wrong question. And that is really what I think he is indicating what the mind is. The mind is necessary in order to do the procedural stuff, to set up the experiments and ask the questions of nature. But he then, by having it saying it's a thinking substance, he's using the old language of the Aristotelians to indicate that so when the body dies, the mind will still be alive. It's a trick, to put it very bluntly. It's an absolute trick. And he also says some ideas, God and the soul, are only in the mind. They're innate ideas. Okay, well, in terms of this frame of reference, that's true. But in terms of the bigger, the bigger picture, so to speak, theological picture, you can see there's no real theological utility to this, at least from the older point of view. Once, though, Descartes gets followers like Malebranche, and they will start to work this into more traditional kind of theology. But again, the biblical panorama, the vista, it's vanished. It's gone. You might as well not have a church if this is what you argue. Okay, so when he speaks of the body being an extended substance, he basically likens a body to a ball of wax and all these different things. So what he's saying is everything that we can see in the world, or even not see, that we can make an inference about, or in our model we think, no, there must be some entity there that we need to draw upon, which he does, and wrongly, as I said. But we can see that it must be extended in some way, and it's akin to wax. And the good use of imagination is doing what he does, and these are from his books. You know, you can see it. He's using the imagination to set up a model to do scientific work. So, in that work, in his works in the meditation, he proves God exists, but God is purely a means of guaranteeing order. There's no love restriction. He proves the existence of the soul, but soul is nothing but cognitive functions. And really, this, I think, is a really important... He never published this work during his lifetime. It's called The World. And he knew that his teachings were very dangerous. And he explicitly says there are no miracles, and there cannot be miracles in the Cartesian world. Because if there were miracles in the Cartesian world, that would mean that the laws of nature aren't constant. And the whole point of bringing God in, and then also a soul that is a set of cognitive operations, is to plot and lay down and identify the rules. Note that this is a completely scientific and determined one. Though Descartes does say, and will differ from Spinoza, who says there is no free will. He says, well, when we speak, we can see a certain kind of freedom. So this allows for a will which affirms or denies. So there is a kind of freedom of the will in Descartes. But ultimately, that doesn't transcend the bodily pushes and forces. And Descartes was also one of the first behavioral psychologists. I don't know if any of you have ever studied psychology, but usually in every first year psychology book, there's a map of the brain. And in the map of the brain, you see all these different parts of it doing different things. And I'll just say that is an utterly Cartesian way of doing things. And I will mention one other thing in passing. In some places, Descartes deals with the problem of the mind being joined to the body. And he says it's in the pineal gland. So the mind is joined to the body. And this is because in that book, The Passions of the Soul, and this is where he talks about this, in The Passions of the Soul, you can see that the mind is really being read in purely materialistic, that is, bodily extended terms. And how could the pineal gland be anything other than an extended substance? And so that's starting to move into very different. Okay, so some, like Hobbes and Spinoza, thought Descartes wasn't deterministic enough, and by being deterministic, I mean they want to plot all the laws that make us do things, and both of them don't think that we've got any freedom. I mentioned his system of physics ultimately broke down because of the problem of gravity. But he would provide this new metaphysical language. Spinoza, Descartes brushes up against the problem of ethics. And he basically realizes he's introduced a method that you could not only look at nature, but you could look at social reality. And he says he's not going to do that. But he does say it's very understandable why someone who wants to move into a new house has to live in the old one before they do that. Which is to say, and then he says how important it is to obey the customs of your land. But you notice he lived in all these Protestant countries. He didn't want to obey the Catholic customs. So although he called himself a Catholic because your denomination, he had to be something, that was very convenient, because when you're in a Protestant country, they'll leave you alone, if they're going to leave you alone, because you're not of them. And when you're in it, well, you just don't live in the Catholic country. So yes, he was baptized a Catholic, but there's nothing Catholic about this doctrine, even though the Catholic Melbourne will use some of this to bring Descartes and Augustine into some theological harmony, but at great cost. I won't go into that. Spinoza, though, comes up with an ethics. And an ethics means, we recall ethics in Aristotle, but the difference in Spinoza is really laying down what he thinks is the best way to live one's life. And his ethics is a very stoic ethics. So it has antecedents in the ancient world. Whereas you recall with Aristotle, the whole point of the ethics was preparation for political life. He also does a reading of the Bible in which you see that religion is nothing more than a kind of moral attempt to deal with natural phenomena. So it's kind of, he sees it as a myth, and you can go beyond the myth and you can see the historical condition that people were in, and then you then see what they really meant. So it's a very reductionist view. And again, it's really part of an onslaught on religion. Now, one thing I should mention, in Spinoza, God and nature collapse into one. So although he speaks of the intellectual love of God, for example, the understanding of God is ultimately simply through studying the laws of nature. So that it's very focused now upon continuing, and Spinoza initially presented himself or saw himself out as a disciple of Descartes, and then he starts to find philosophical differences with Descartes, which to him really mattered. One is As I mentioned, the freedom of the will, he doesn't believe that. When the application of the understanding, the rationalization of social experience completely severs itself from the hermeneutical character, the interpretive character and institutional character of the church, and still with the reformers, the hermeneutical character of the but the churches of Christendom, let's pluralize that, and then addresses the question of social obligation, political character, the search for justice, the meaning of life, the role of the political in securing that meaning for us. That is really then the beginning of what we now call the modern. It's taken a long time to get here. This is known as the Enlightenment. It is, in many ways, it sets the template for our orientation in the modern world. In the case of Descartes, he saw philosophy as a tree, the roots of metaphysics, the trunk physics, the branches of various particular sciences, including mechanics, medicine, and morals. But the one thing, now various other philosophers are going to differ with Descartes, but the one thing I think that all the modern Enlightenment thinkers have is that they think that the basis of human ends and the world and social reality are ultimately philosophically explicable. And this will leave a huge legacy, because whether you're aware of it or not, all these claims and values and behaviors and antagonisms of so much of the modern world that dictate conflict around society and around politics, they ultimately come out of the hegemony of philosophy with the fracturing of Christendom. When next week, I had hoped to get to liberalism today, I haven't, but next week I'll start there, and I'll talk about Hobbes and Locke, and then I'll make some other inroads. I'll put up the pace a bit. We've now, in a sense, left the pre-modern, and with this last lot, we start to look at the modern world. Of course, the scientific revolution is not yet the industrial revolution. It's not a world of factories and new technologies, you know, just constantly coming out. But it is a world in which the priorities of human participation, human association, and have been radically transformed. So I'll carry that next week. I'll see you next week.